Also, we're interested in the party politics, and obviously you have, this is the 7th EP and this is the 6th EP. The orange is ENP, the blue is enlargement, and you can sort of already see. I mean, these are usual suspects, right? These are the biggest groups, but you can already see kind of interesting position that specifically enlargement is actually a quite important topic for the right-wing party. So you can see that, and obviously non-attached. But that's there are scholars that are specifically interested in the non-attached group, sort of because this is always a significant part of the MEPs that cannot, as you know, find a place. Most of the cases, they are radical right-wing, and not all of them, but many of them. So that also shows us the interest of the party politics, or the parties within the topic. But I just wanted to go here first. This is the assessment of the enlargement. So this shows maybe a little bit more nuanced picture. I will so what this tells us is that the blue essentially is a positive assessment of a policy. The orange is the negative assessment. So these are. It only was possible for us to collect that data for the EU enlargement, because on ENP everybody is on, everybody is for, right? So basically everybody is saying no, that's fine, but we obviously have our issues. It's much less contested than EU enlargement. So you can clearly see that difference in here. But obviously also you can see that the orange, it's already the gray is a selective. Selective is the situation when someone says I'm very much for EU enlargement for Balkan countries, but not for Turkey, right? So they sort of mix different opinions. So the gray indicates that there is some fundamental criticism, but not overall this kind of negative assessment of the policy. And again, what we can see, this is again 7th EP and the 6th EP, that most of the contestation again happens in the right-wing place. That's something that you probably know. But what I was kind of quite interesting is that the EPP, for instance, it accommodates a lot of the criticism. You'd ask, is it why in the 6th EP we noted more? Because there was more debates about Turkey, and this specifically concerned the moment of the opening of negotiations. So 2005 and the years, sort of 2004, 2005, leading to opening negotiations, and years after. Here we, the sort of criticism was less, was more vicious in a way, but less visible statistically, because there was less debate specifically concerning Turkey. It became less sort of debated. So what are the main lines of contestation? Sort of more qualitative analysis. The main lines of contestation of enlargement is the democracy and democratization. And one of the most interesting findings for us was that the democratization is a major frame for both policies, and yet in both cases it loses the salience. You can see how how those political actors are sort of departing from this very sort of normatively driven stance on democratization. We were also looking at how were they justifying those claims in the policies. And it is also interesting that the value-based justifications were actually losing to the more and more sort of utility-based justifications, which is essentially cost benefit assessment, right? That does it benefit us in a way? And specifically in the EPP, that's visible in the EU enlargement. The European socialists, they kept that going more or less through the democratization. What is also important is that the major frame for the enlargement is really security. The policy is really assessed essentially as bringing, so assessed positively if it stabilizes neighborhood, if it makes EU more stable, more secure. However, the specificity of the EU enlargement is also the discussion about what it does to the integration itself. And that claim that more you dilute, more broader EU, so this widening versus deepening discussion. I will spare details, maybe we can do this in a Q&A later on, but that sort of is interesting sort of discursive strategies that were employed by some delegations. For instance, the German MEPs that were against really Turkish enlargement, they were very creative in finding something that could be, you know, how you could name it differently so that it actually still is very strategic, super wonderful, great partnership, but it actually is not enlargement anymore. While others are less sort of creative in finding those ways as this, we shouldn't enlarge that direction, for instance. What is also important is that the enlargement really is frequented by the cultural and identitarian frames. And this is something that we found very interesting, is that the major contestation really happens through employment of cultural and identitarian terms, which is interesting because a lot of scholars working in a politicization realm on domestic front, they say that if those frames are employed, the politicization happen, it facilitates politicization. And you can see that in the EU enlargement, and it's almost absent in the neighborhood policy. Importantly, right? So we can again go back to the point that foreign policy is relatively immune from politicization as long as you don't have those cultural frames that actually help doing it. And again, in a volume that I just recently co-edited, there is a text by a scholar who looks at the religious elements, sort of how the Islam is framed and how it's framed differently in a context of neighborhood and in the context of enlargement, for instance. So once it is a threat, and in the different context, it's not, because it's the object being, in that case, polity, is sort of positioned differently. The ENP is much less contested than the enlargement. You would say, okay, that's fine, but it is by radical parties. And what we found interesting, for instance, is that the radical parties are actually contesting ENP in the European Parliament, and the same parties. They don't on the national front, which on the other hand was kind of interesting for us. So mostly, so there is still a consensus on the main parties on neighborhood policy. There is obviously far-going criticism of the policy, as must be in a way. And again, the ENP is essentially dominated by utility-based arguments. It's security, 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 and then economics, right? Sort of basically in that order. Value-based arguments are rare, and if they're appearing, they basically concern: should we promote European values, and at which cost, right? So when, in which situations, and then really the value-based argument sort of kicks in this foreign policy realm. Also, I think this is the, as I said, this is the frequency of the words of the top 5 and Ireland delegations when it comes to the European neighbourhood policy. So this is sort of shows you also that they essentially speak different world. I mean, it's almost I mean, if you look here at France, it's essentially Mediterranean and South, almost no reference to Eastern dimension. If you look at Poland, so these are the most frequently speaking. This is basically about the Eastern Europe. Germany and UK are trying to somehow balance the sides in a way, right? And I've also looked in Italy. It's almost nothing about the Eastern Europe. So that's also kind of interesting. And in enlargement, it doesn't work that way. So in enlargement, when you look, they are interested it's more ideological, in a sense that when the polity shape comes to the front, the ideological dimension kicks in. In the ENP, it's still the EP is treated as a place where you actually promote national preference. We compare it to what the same parties, I mean, not the same people, obviously, but the same parties are speaking on national level. And what we found interesting is that on the national level, they speak about those policies differently. So you have the same preference, and that preference is differently framed, presented, and even rhetorically used in the European Parliament, very often through referring to the community interest, while on national front they speak like, we do that because that pays us, or that is very in line with what we want to achieve. So just the national parliaments, very briefly, I know that I should be finishing very soon. So the national parliaments, it's still, I will not go into details. I mean, you can tell, very long stories about each of those parliaments. First of all, in the national parliaments, in none of the cases that we were researching, they do a review of the particular policy. So, it's very difficult to compare it to the European Parliament debates, in a sense that in the EP you have a debate on the review of ENP, right? In the national parliament, you have at best a discussion about the region that ENP covers, or of the instruments that the ENP or enlargement is employing. So we pre-selected the debate so that it actually covers as much as possible of those debates. We also went for the committee discussions on national level, specifically because those debates are much more sort of concrete, I'd say. But again, and we were looking in those selected debates, what do they talk about? And again, you have UK and Ireland. The orange is enlargement. In Poland is ENP. In Poland, the one thing here is that in Poland, we pre-selected the yearly foreign policy reviews, so that these are super long debates about everything foreign policy. So it's less percentage of all, because the kind of meat was bigger. So that's different. But that already tells you that for UK and in the House of Commons for 10 years, you can hear very clearly that the EU enlargement is the major priority of a British government within the European Union, right? It's repeated. The MPs are stating its importance. So basically, this is the contestation in the British House of Commons. Very positive assessment of EU enlargement, priority and bipartisan consensus. We're also looking at the polarization of opinion. I will not bring it here because it's a huge story about how to measure polarization of opinion in foreign policy, so we can talk about it if you want later, but I'll just skip that part. What is shocking it was shocking to me really in the British case was how come you can talk for long hours about the EU instruments and not mentioning EU. And this sort of is interesting. The enlargement is a policy and it's a priority. ENP is some sort of instrument that someone does and we use it within our British national foreign policy, right? It almost doesn't have a name. It's some focus of Eastern Partnership, but not much really. Main arguments in a British case, very utility-based, referring to security and economic gains. Economic in a very different way than other research cases. So you can very clearly see that there is a very specific free traders team within the House of Commons on both sides, pushing this. No much of contestation of the EU enlargement. I found that interesting, again, that in British case, neither ENP, that's understandable because they don't talk much about it, but nor EU enlargement is actually raising a cultural and identitarian frames, even in relation to Turkey. Right? So it's you can see that in the parliament, in every debate that there is on Turkey, it comes to the forefront. In the UK, you just need to search for that one. But something additional, EU enlargement very often presented, and again on both sides, Labour and Tory, as a guarantee of shallow integration. Right? So it's not only a priority for your foreign policy, but it's also your priority for how you're gonna secure European Union from its unfortunate F word that you cannot even say out loud, right? Because it's a bad word. So it's sort of anti-federalism. And finally, a very interesting fact that Labour wasn't really much into it. In the EP, on the other hand, similarity in the sense of the interest in EU enlargement, but the parties that are not in Westminster are actually vocal users of identitarian and cultural claims in the EP. So UKIP, BNP, they are actually super loud in the EP. And they obviously are not in the national parliament, they are in the British, public sphere. But it's kind of interesting how they are mobilizing those frames that are missing somehow from the national parliament. When it comes to Polish case, again, a very interesting I think something that you can find in many of the Central and Eastern European cases, it obviously changes with time. We started in 2004 when those policies were not even mentioned. It was all about the kind of some sort of hazy European integration that you have there and you need to make sense of, into the point when they learn that those are instruments, these are actually resources that you can use for your own kind of foreign policy use, especially when they overlap with your national priorities. And here you go. And it's like full-fledged acceptance that they mostly framed as sort of instruments in pushing own agenda on national level. And obviously the main frame in Poland is security. It's security, 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 and basically you need to look really hard to get other frames such as economic benefits or something like that. Similarly, almost no identitarian and cultural frames. An additional interesting thing, the main line of contestation is between two major parties, the ruling party and opposition party. We've been in the law and justice government and civic platform being opposition, and the reverse version, specifically on ENP and Eastern Partnership. So you have actually probably the Polish case is the only one when you can really see that on national level you have a politicization of an issue of specifically Eastern Partnership, not as a policy, but as a kind of how it's done. What is kind of interesting is the radical right-wing parties that are, again, vocal in the European Parliament they are in a national parliament in Poland, in contrast to the British case, and they not speak. And again, that sort of is, again, interesting. So the radical parties, specifically right-wing, we know what's their agenda, but in the national parliaments, that's the strategic behavior is not to participate, not to speak, because there is I'm developing this because there is a main party consensus. There's a securitization of this issue, and it's not but this results until 2014. I bet if we will take the parliament at the moment, you'll see that this is eroding. This is gradually eroding. And again, that's a kind of maybe slightly different reflection here, is that in case of Poland, what you can also see a sort of desecuritization of certain discourse around European integration. And that's something that is at least partially cause or effect of certain politicization of European integration in this region. On the EP level, very similar frames. A major difference is that there is almost no conflict. So you can see on the national level, you see the conflict between the ruling party and opposition party, and it's almost gone when those same two parties are going to the EP, and they still are different. They use different arguments. They don't probably like each other still, but when it comes to the justifications, they're on the same front, right? So that's another case here. And there is a very visible change in rhetoric. That's visible on Polish case. Again, it's not Polish unique, I guess, where on the EP level, you have a very clear reference to community interest and much less on national preference, but this national preference is sort of concealed in a way. It's as something that should be, well, when you go to Sejm, it's basically straightforward. That's not our national, we like this policy because it basically helps us to do what we want. As simple as that one. When it comes to the Irish case, The Irish case is very specific. They speak relatively much less than both other parliaments about the foreign policy issues in general, and specifically those two policies. If one of those policies is more visible, that's enlargement. And because of certain radical party actors, there's also a growing or a present interest in the Middle East case, and specifically Israel, that raises a lot of frames. No much of contestation, very rare cultural and identitarian frames, also in the relations to Turkey. And the same, the Irish case, it's sort of problematic in the sense that it's a small group of MEPs, so it's obviously much more party sensitive. So what you can see, for instance, is that the Irish MEPs from GUNGL are super active in debate, specifically in the Middle East conflict. So statistically, they somehow change. But it's interesting because it's a country that I was selected here as a case that has no clear preference in either of those policies, right? So then you can clearly see if there is no national preference, this policy is not really present very much in the national debate. So that's another point, is that there is a kind of domestic source of why the given issue is debated. So to conclusions, and I really should stop in here. The patterns of the contestation differs along the policies. So something that I covered is that the EU enlargement is very differently contested. It's contested as essentially as a polity building policy, while ENP is even if we really tackled Arab Spring period, we only, because we ended on 2014, so we only covered like half year of the Ukraine conflict, but it also shows something. But even when you have the conflict of the magnitude or crisis of the magnitude of the Arab Spring and it follow up, I mean, so-called Arab Spring, still ENP is much less contested, right? So even in that case, this foreign policy is still kept as a. I mean, there is a lot of discussion about how it is implemented, where should we go, but much less than enlargement as such. And there is a domestic origins of activism within those on the EP level. Strategic culture overlap with national foreign policy preferences, and that it produces a different patterns of contestation in terms of party conflict and rhetoric style. While on the national and European level, so the other comparison, so to say, or kind of bigger picture, we can see very clearly what I found the most interesting is that those radical contesters, they are not choosing national arenas as their theater for their claims. They go to the EP, and for UK that's understandable because they're not in the parliament. For Poland that's maybe less clear why they do it. The identitarian cultural frames are very visible on the EP level. In the Turkish case they're less visible on the national level, but I guess again if we would continue this in the more recent years, that would probably also be changing. Yes, and that's it. I think we should start, and obviously this is an advertising now. So it's time. We just published a book on contestation of EU enlargement and European neighborhood policy. It's an edited volume that covers this research, but also other scholars that are looking into the public opinion. They look into the civil society organizations, with Hans Vollard from Utrecht University covering a wonderful case of the referendum in the Netherlands on Ukraine association agreement, was a very interesting insight into how it really was not about foreign policy. And other wonderful scholars that actually were trying with us to map those actors domestically, not only parliaments, but also political parties, specifically Eurosceptic political parties, public opinion, in the context of migration, in the context of Eurobarometer, and also the civil society organizations. So if you're interested, this book is out right now. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll have questions.
Thank you very much, Magda, for this most interesting lecture and the insights into your current research and research results, including the publicity. Questions? I'll prepare a microphone. I see Eva thinking already, and a couple of others. That's good news. Who would like to make a start? Eva, perfect.
I was just wondering, concerning the results of the whole research, if you would have had to make hypotheses in the beginning of your research, and compare them with what the end result was, what would have been the one that was completely not what you expected? Because a lot of the things are kind of
Intuitive?
yeah, exactly, yeah. So what was the one thing that, okay, this is completely different from what we expected, and it's not only telling what we already felt that might be the case. I was interested in that.
I think one of the we assumed, obviously, that the EU enlargement will be more contested, right? That it will actually borrow this domestic contestation pattern, so to say, and it kind of bring it there. But I did not expect ENP not being that much questioned. I expected, to be honest, that it will actually raise much fundamental debate about this policy. And obviously, in the book we describe, and there is this book, there is a monograph on this one, so we describe the sort of the kind of in detail all of those strategic frames that are very often attached to those policies, for ENP being democratization and so on, and it is kind of revealing. In the end of the day, I think one thing that happens in the ENP, and that also was on the other hand something that we expected, and is that there is a growing departure from this sort of normative claim for the EU to play a role in the global affairs into the EU should take care of our citizens and our safety, our concerns, our benefits, whatever they are, because that actually is differently defined along the ideological lines, right? But that's sort of something that I found interesting. It's a decade, right? When we looked at this in a decade, and you can see also this growing up, a lot of optimism and a very pessimistic account year after year after year. And in Arab Spring, that's the same, right? It's the first reaction was like, wow, this is happening, so let's see what's gonna happen. And just a couple of months later is like, oh my God, how are we gonna deal with that? And another sort of point is that how this fluctuates really in terms of the events. The second point, I didn't see when it comes to because we also looked and we compared the party groups' positions on EU level and then national party systems when it comes to foreign policy, to be honest, and that's maybe my optimism. I assume that political parties are having far more developed ideas about foreign policy in general, and they seem to be doing that as we sit in here, I think. And that's another interesting point, is that those policies, they are not easy because their contestation, for instance, the Turkish case, it's not easy for EPP to grasp because it actually goes very often against certain lines that EPP was developing within a EU foreign policy for decades. And it's a case that actually contradicts some of those, and you can see how it's difficult for them to find a stance. On the national level, it's mostly the partisan consensus. I mean, we know it, right? I mean, you probably know the concept that comes from the American senator from Vanderbilt. I think the politics ends at the water's edge, right? When Truman administration asked the Republican Party, I guess, to support the Truman Doctrine, he said that the politics ends at the water's edge, meaning that security issues enforce that we should actually work the bipartisan consensus for the sake of national security. And a lot of this type of consensus when it comes to security issues, it exists very much within this field. So that's also kind of interesting. And it's eroding definitely in Polish case, which I found also quite interesting, and specifically that it actually become very visible when you see. And obviously the Brexit case. That's something, you never know what happens. So we didn't see that coming when we were designing the research for the application and, before the years passed. So, yeah.
Yeah, during your research, you analyzed a lot of speeches and parliament debates that link us together to the political parties and to the member of the national parties and the member of the European Parliament. Now, I wanted to ask, until what extent